Hi, my name is Narina. My parents told me I was getting a fresh start, but what they really did was send me off alone to a frozen house no one had lived in for years. No goodbye hugs, no second thoughts, just an envelope and a one-way bus ride to a place they'd buried like a secret. They called it independence. But when I walked into that crumbling house, what I found was proof they'd been erasing me long before I ever left. Why would a family plan a disappearance without ever saying the word goodbye? The snow had already started falling when I pulled up to my parents' house. It wasn't unusual for Wisconsin in January, but this storm felt different. Too quiet, too perfect, like the kind of silence that comes just before a siren. I parked a little farther from the curb than usual, the tires slipping slightly on the already icing pavement. The porch light was on. That alone should have told me something was off. They never left the porch light on anymore. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and lemon cleaner. Valora always cleaned like it was an Olympic sport, but today it smelled sanitized, like a showroom. Daxter's coat was already on the rack, and the scent of his expensive aftershave hovered near the stairs. He only ever used that when he wanted to look like he gave a damn. "Come in, sweetheart," Valora said from the dining room, her voice lilting unnaturally. She even called me sweetheart. That wasn't normal. The table was set like Thanksgiving. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, rolls she probably didn't bake herself. I walked in slow, like stepping into a stage set I didn't remember auditioning for. Dad, Osric, sat at the head, looking down into his water glass like he was hoping it might explain why we were all here. Daxter glanced up from his phone just long enough to give me a nod. Not a smile, just a nod. I sat. "We've been talking," Valora began, her hands folded neatly over a cloth napkin. "And we think it's time you had something of your own, a fresh start." I blinked. I hadn't asked for anything, not a penny, not a favor, certainly not a life reassignment. "You've always been the strong one," she continued, "the independent spirit. And now that the Monroe place is vacant—" "The what?" I interrupted. Osric shifted. "Your grandmother's house. It's yours now." Valora reached into her purse and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, labeled neatly in her handwriting. "Transition plan." My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Inside, the words blurred with a cold clarity. The deed to the house had already been processed, utilities transferred, mail redirected. Just like that. No discussion, just decision. I forced a nod. "And this was when decided?" "Oh, it's been in motion for a while," Daxter finally spoke, without looking up. "We just didn't want to overwhelm you." Right. Overwhelm me. Like sending a person into exile without calling it that. I excused myself to the bathroom, hands trembling. Not with anger, not yet. I opened my banking app out of habit, mostly because I wanted to make sure I could afford gas to Monroe, wherever the hell that was. The joint savings account I'd shared with Valora, what we'd used for Eudora's hospice care, and where I'd kept my emergency fund, was gone, closed, zero balance. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stared at the screen like it might blink and change back. But it didn't. It just stared back at me like I should have known. Back at the table, Valora smiled as I returned. "All set?" "Yeah," I said, sitting down, the room spinning gently. "All set." I didn't eat. I couldn't. Every bite on that plate had been dressed up like comfort, but I couldn't taste anything. "You've always been so strong," Valora said again, pouring wine only for herself. "We knew you'd make this work." And now, that line, I saw it for what it really was. Not praise, not encouragement. It was permission to vanish. I nodded slowly, a mask of politeness slipping into place. They wanted me gone, wanted it neat, wanted it without scenes or accusations. I could play that part, for now. When the night finally wrapped itself in silence, I rose to leave. Daxter barely looked up. Valora offered a hug, but I sidestepped it, reaching instead for my coat. Osric met me at the door. No hug, no warmth. just a stiff handshake and 4 words. Let us know, okay? I nodded. I stepped into the snow. It slapped against my face and shoulders like tiny punishments, but I didn't pull my collar tighter. The cold didn't matter anymore. I clutched the envelope, transition plan, as I walked toward the car. The porch light dimmed behind me, and it hit me like a whisper I hadn't wanted to hear. I'd been dismissed. Not sent. Not offered. Dismissed. As I walked away into the freezing snow, I still held on to the envelope I hadn't dared to open yet. The next evening, I got the text around 5. "We want to send you off properly," it read. Valora always did love phrasing things like a press release. I stared at the message for a full minute before responding with a simple, "Okay." I didn't have the energy to argue. Part of me hoped there was some sense of regret behind it, some late realization that they'd handled things poorly. But mostly, I knew better. By 6, I was back at the house, the same one where I'd been handed an eviction disguised as a gift. Snow was already caking the street, a fresh advisory blinking on the highway signs I passed. I parked further down this time, not wanting to block anyone else's way out. The front door opened before I could knock. Valora's voice floated through the hall. "Come in, honey, we're just getting started." She was wearing a champagne-colored blouse and too much perfume, as if overdressing could cancel out what had already been done. Streamers hung from the dining room chandelier. A banner that said "New Beginnings" curved above the windows. On the table sat a cake, a gift bag stuffed with tissue paper, and a roast that was already cooling on the serving plate. I felt like I was walking into a staged goodbye party for someone who'd already died. Daxter's wife, Amber, waved like we were best friends. Aunt Rhea smiled wide and offered a glass of cider. No one asked how I was feeling. Not one soul asked if I was okay. The only thing anyone wanted to know was what I planned to do once I got settled in Monroe. I mumbled vague answers, letting their questions pass through me like static. The whole evening felt like a script they'd rehearsed without me. Even Osric managed a half-hearted chuckle when Valora made a joke about me finally learning how to garden. Halfway through the meal, there was a knock at the door. A delivery guy in a red parka handed over a manila envelope. Valora accepted it like she'd been waiting for it all night. "Oh, perfect timing," she chirped, turning toward me. "Go ahead and open it, sweetie." I stared at her. "What is it?" "Just the transfer documents for the house," she said, like she was offering me an extra slice of pie. "All official now, it's yours." I opened the envelope slowly, hands already going numb. Inside were the full legal documents assigning me ownership of the Monroe property. It was signed, notarized, and dated. Today. Effective immediately. I looked around. Everyone was smiling. Rhea clapped. Amber cheered like I'd just won a game show. Daxter raised his glass in mock salute. No one seemed to notice that I hadn't spoken. There was no conversation, no choice. Just applause for a performance I hadn't agreed to give. I needed air. I slipped out the side door, letting the cold slap me awake. The wind hit hard, stinging my cheeks and filling my lungs with something real for the first time all night. That's when I heard Mrs. Langston's voice behind me. "Heading to Monroe already?" she asked, her breath forming tiny clouds in the air. She was bundled in a wool coat, her snow boots crusted with salt. "Just stepping out," I managed. She smiled gently. "I always thought that house was yours all along. Your grandma told me it was settled years ago." My spine stiffened. "She did?" "Oh, yes," she said with a nod. "Said she left it to you directly. Said you'd understand why." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Back inside, everything had cooled. The roast sat untouched. The room buzzed with meaningless chatter. And then I saw it. The cake. Sitting in the center of the table like a final joke. "Congrats, Marina," it read. Marina. Daxter glanced at me and shrugged. "Just a typo. Don't let it ruin the mood." I picked up the cake knife, stared at the frosting that was supposed to spell my name, and handed the blade to Valora. "You do the honors," I said, my voice flat. "I think I'm done celebrating." No one said a word. The room didn't fall silent so much as it froze in place. I turned and left before anyone could stop me, the envelope clutched in my coat pocket like it might catch fire at any second. I walked away before anyone could stop me, holding the envelope like it might burn through my coat. I walked the entire way home. The snow wasn't falling, it was attacking. Wind whipped my cheeks, and flakes stung my eyes, but I didn't pull up my hood. My gloves stayed in my coat pockets. My fingers were red, stiff, and wet from gripping the envelope like it was the last piece of me I could hold on to. That paper didn't weigh more than a few ounces, but somehow it dragged my entire arm down with it. Storefronts along the street glowed with warm light, families inside laughing, sharing meals. The contrast cut deeper than the cold. Their worlds felt whole. Mine felt like it had just been handed to someone else to dismantle. By the time I reached my apartment building, I was soaked to the knees. I walked the 3 flights of stairs instead of waiting for the elevator. Each step gave me time to push the tightness in my chest down, just far enough to unlock the door with a steady hand. As soon as it closed behind me, I let go. Not in the loud, crashing kind of way, just collapse. My coat puddled on the floor. My boots leaned like they wanted to fall over. I sat on the edge of the couch, and for the first time in years, I let my face crumple. No sobbing. Just a stillness too heavy for breathing. Sleep didn't come. I made tea, didn't drink it, opened the fridge, closed it. I paced the living room, checked my phone, ignored it again. Eventually, I found myself in the hallway closet, pulling down the worn cardboard box I hadn't touched since the last time I'd thought about leaving Milwaukee for good. Inside were fragments, yearbooks with sticky pages, school photos from picture days I barely remembered, a few postcards from Grandma Eudora, and a dusty manila folder labeled Keep. At the bottom was a photo from my 10th birthday. It used to sit on the mantel in my childhood home. We were all in it. Me, Daxter, Valora, Osric, even Aunt Rhea. I remembered the cake, vanilla with strawberry frosting, and I remembered the balloons. I remembered being happy. Now, my face in the photo had been scratched out. Not torn, not faded, scratched. Like someone had taken a pen or the edge of a coin and carved through my image. Just me. Everyone else was intact. I stared at it, numb at first. Then heat surged from my spine to my scalp. I flipped it over. On the back, in Valora's handwriting, it read, "Family, 1994. Apparently, not all of us." I reached back into the box. Underneath a folder of report cards was a red notebook, my diary from middle school. I hadn't seen it in over 2 decades. I opened it slowly, as if it might bite. The first few pages were harmless. Sketches of trees, notes about Eudora's garden, my list of books to read when I'm a grown-up. But then, near the middle, something shifted. Entire pages had been scribbled over in angry red pen. Notes scrawled in the margins. "Don't be so dramatic. This makes us look bad. And once, why would you even write this?" It was her handwriting. Valora's. Clear as day. I sat back on the floor, my knees pulled in tight. What kind of mother reads her child's private thoughts, only to shame her for having them? This wasn't just a forgotten diary. It was a gag order, a silencing, a red ink rejection of my voice. I started connecting dots in my head. How my stories were never the ones told at family dinners. How my memories were always corrected. "That's not how it happened," they'd say. How every time I challenged their version of things, I was labeled ungrateful, difficult, unstable. What if all of this transition, this gifting of the Monroe house, wasn't just abrupt? What if it had been in motion for years? What if it wasn't a sudden exile, but a long, quiet removal of my place in the family? I stood, walked to the kitchen counter where I'd dropped the envelope the night before, and picked it up. I hadn't looked at it since the party. Something in me had known I wasn't ready. I unfolded it carefully. The top pages were just what I remembered. Ownership confirmation, county records, change of address notices. But then a page I hadn't noticed slipped out from between them. It was a handwritten checklist. Utilities off, locks changed, keys sent, name removed, all in Valora's script. That wasn't a plan for transition. It was an erasure. I stared at that checklist, each bullet point stabbing like proof I was never meant to stay. By morning, the storm hadn't let up. It howled outside my apartment, like it had something personal to say. The windows were fogged, the snow stacked high on the sills, and I hadn't slept a minute. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. Sleep felt indulgent when you just learned you were erased like a typo. The checklist sat on the kitchen table, Valora's handwriting still crisp, still smug. Locks changed, keys sent, name removed. There wasn't a single word of hesitation. It read like a to-do list for canceling a subscription. Only the subscription was me. I folded the list in half, and then again, but I didn't throw it out. That would have let her win twice. Somewhere near the back of my mind, a decision had started to form. It didn't come with fanfare or lightning bolts, just a quiet steadiness settling into my chest. I got dressed, layers, thick socks, boots, and pulled the old box from the laundry closet, the one I hadn't touched since before Eudora died. The lid creaked as I opened it. Inside, a pile of folders, a few rolled posters from school projects, some printouts of college applications that never got sent. Beneath them all, I found the certificate. Regional Arts Showcase finalist, age 17. My name still visible beneath the coffee stain. The edges were curled, one corner torn. I remembered Valora pulling it down from the fridge the morning after I taped it there. "Don't be dramatic," she'd said, tossing it on the counter like junk mail. "That's not real success. You think that'll get you into something worthwhile?" Back then, I believed her. Now, I tucked the certificate into my coat pocket. Behind the art folder was another, labeled private. I hesitated. It was old, brittle. Most of the papers inside were yellowed, folded and refolded so many times they looked like origami. A summer camp letter I'd written, returned and never opened. My handwriting was loopy and hopeful, the kind of letter that starts with "Hi Mom and Dad" and ends with "I miss you so much." They never read it. And then, at the very bottom, I found a sealed envelope with my mother's cursive. Tight, straight lines, always too neat to be warm. I opened it with shaking fingers. "We've given her enough," it began. "At this point, she has to make it on her own. She takes too much space and gives nothing back." There was no sugarcoating, no nuance, just cold strategy. It was signed by both Valora and Osric, dated just 3 months ago, right around the time they started prepping the Monroe house. So it wasn't an emotional decision. It wasn't born from some heartache or family misunderstanding. It was business. I sat for a while, the letter in one hand, the checklist in the other. Everything Valora ever told me about tough love or teaching independence dissolved in that moment. She hadn't been tough or loving. She'd been calculating, and I'd been convenient to forget. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or tear anything in half. I grabbed a duffel and started packing with the kind of clarity that only comes when you stop trying to be accepted. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, the flashlight, the charger, a pocket knife, a notebook. I threw in the scratched photo, the stained certificate, and the letter. I left behind clothes I never liked and gifts I never asked for. I kept only what had been stolen from me and now reclaimed. By the time the sun threatened to rise, I had zipped the bag and set it by the door. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. I wasn't trying to find anything in my face. I just wanted to acknowledge that I still had one. "You weren't wrong," I whispered to myself. "They were." The power flickered. I didn't flinch. Before locking the apartment behind me, I took one last look around. This space, once mine, had become just another room they'd pushed me into. Except this time, I was choosing to leave it. The cold outside didn't scare me anymore. What I was walking toward did. The station was nearly empty at 6 in the morning. Just a bench and a flickering overhead light that hummed louder than the silence. I stepped onto the bus with my duffel, coat zipped to my chin, and the envelope still tucked in my inside pocket, creased now from my grip but untouched. The driver, an older man with a bear's beanie pulled low, gave me a once-over. "Monroe?" he asked. "I don't think anyone is," I said, and found a seat near the back. We pulled out of Milwaukee in darkness. Snow drifted sideways, blanketing exits and erasing signs like the highway itself wanted to forget. I watched the edges of the city disappear behind us, the lights fading into nothing. The ride took longer than expected. Rural roads slowed us, visibility dropping to almost zero. I didn't sleep, just counted turns in the road like they might lead somewhere other than where I was going. By mid-morning, the bus pulled to a stop at a patch of road that barely qualified as a town entrance. No signs, no gas station, just a white field broken by a crooked fence and the faint suggestion of mailboxes. I got off. No one else did. The driver handed me my bag with a grunt. "You got someone picking you up?" No. He didn't ask another question. I walked. Each step crunched into ice. The town, if you could still call it that, was mostly hidden behind thick snow. Houses sagged with the weight of winter, paint peeling under frost. Monroe wasn't a place you moved to. It was where people ended up. I had the address, scrawled in pen on the back of a bill, but my phone GPS blinked, "No service." I had to guess. 5th house on the left. Maybe 6th. The numbers were covered in frost. I found it by shape, not by name. The front steps were nearly buried. I climbed them slowly, boots cracking the thin layer of ice that had formed on the wood. The key fit the lock, but I had to lean my whole weight into the door to get it open. Inside, the house breathed stillness. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that settles in when everything human has left. The air smelled of closed-in wood, metal, and time. I stood in the foyer, breath fogging in front of me. No heat, no hum of power. Just a hollow echo as I set my bag down. I tried the light switch. Nothing. I walked through the kitchen. The cabinets hung slightly ajar. The fridge was empty, its door left open like someone had stopped mid-move. The heating oil tank, in a corner of the pantry, was bone dry. Pipes groaned when I tested the faucet. Frozen. There were no blankets, no matches, no sign of preparation, just a single half-burned candle on the kitchen counter. I tried to light it. The wick crumbled. I wrapped my coat tighter and sat on the floor. I didn't think I'd cry, and I didn't. But the kind of silence that house gave off, it clung to your lungs. It made you breathe slower, as if it might crack under sound. I pulled out my phone to check for signal. 1 bar. Enough to play the voicemail I'd missed during the ride. It was Aunt Rhea. Her voice, usually bright, sounded strangely flat. "Your mom always said that house would be for when you'd outlived your usefulness. Guess it's that time now." She didn't laugh. She didn't soften it. That was the whole message. I listened to it twice, then deleted it. Outside, the wind howled through bare trees, shaking the windows in their frames. I walked back into the kitchen. The candle still sat there. I picked it up again, tried lighting it with the one match I found in my coat. It sparked, then went out. "You sent me to freeze," I said out loud, to no one. "Let's see if I thaw on my own." That night, I didn't sleep. I waited, but I didn't know what for. Morning didn't look any different. The light outside had changed from pitch black to that particular shade of cold blue that only comes when everything's frozen stiff. I hadn't slept. Not because I couldn't, but because my body had surrendered to stillness. I stayed curled on the floor all night, coat zipped up, gloved hands gripping my knees beneath a blanket that didn't exist. I sat up slowly. My bones creaked in protest. Muscles ached from the floor, not from labor, but from resignation. The house didn't groan, didn't sigh. It just watched. The heat still hadn't returned. I knew that by the way my breath hung in the air, stubborn and visible. But I wasn't as fragile as yesterday. I was hungry, but I didn't look for food. I looked for evidence. I started with the old hallway. the one with water-stained wallpaper and warped baseboards. I opened doors I hadn't touched yet, closets that creaked like they hadn't been disturbed in years. In the last bedroom, beneath a dusty blue comforter folded on a chair, I found a dresser sealed with layers of aged packing tape. I pulled until it gave way. Inside was a mess of tangled yarn, old pins, scraps of faded fabric. My grandmother's sewing box, just as I remembered it. Underneath was a stack of papers, property tax receipts, old Christmas cards, and a thin manila envelope labeled in pencil, barely legible. For Narina, if they let her come. I sat back on the floor. My fingers trembled. Not from cold this time, but something close to fury. Not rage, not yet. Something colder, sharper. A kind of quiet knowing. I opened the envelope. Inside was a version of Eudora's will, dated 2 years prior to the one Valora had shown me. It was older, yes, but notarized, legal. And in it, I was named not just the heir to the house, but to its contents. Everything. It hadn't been left to the family. It hadn't been left to whoever needed it. It was mine. The pages were slightly wrinkled, like they'd been balled up at some point and later smoothed out. And I knew who did that. Someone had tried to bury it, literally and metaphorically. Attached behind the will was another document, printed, folded, and faintly yellowed. A hospice record. My name, clearly typed, listed as Eudora's primary caregiver for the last 5 months of her life. The signature at the bottom was nearly erased, a soft gray smudge where ink used to be. But the header was intact, and the seal still showed. I remembered printing this record. I remembered handing it to Valora during the week we packed Eudora's things. She hadn't even looked at it. "You don't need to show off with your sacrifices," she'd said, stuffing it into a drawer. I stared at it now. It wasn't a trophy. It was proof that I'd been there, that I mattered, that I wasn't a footnote in someone else's plan. I walked back into the kitchen. My hands moved automatically, grabbing a small jar of candle wax from the drawer near the sink. I used a piece of twine I found in a tool drawer and twisted it into a wick. I placed it in a bowl, lit it with the last match in my coat pocket, and watched the small flame come to life. I sat beside it, knees pulled in again, this time with the documents in a stack beside me. I didn't look away from the fire. Not once. They had planned this. Not yesterday. Not last week. Long before the party. Long before the Monroe house came up in conversation. They had laid the tracks. I was just the one they pushed onto them. And now, I had something they didn't expect. Their own paper trail, sealed in their own handwriting, buried in the walls of the very house they thought would silence me. And if they planned it this far back, what else have they buried? The third morning in Monroe didn't begin with warmth. It never did. But at least it brought light. Sunlight sliced through the slats of the broken blinds, painting thin lines across the peeling wallpaper. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, legs curled beneath a blanket I'd fashioned out of an old curtain. My phone rested on the windowsill, plugged into a solar charger I'd found tucked in the back of a drawer. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't care. Hope was a currency I wasn't trading in that day. An hour later, the screen flickered to life, 10% battery. Just enough for a message. Maybe 2. And there it was. A voicemail from my cousin Claire, time-stamped late the night before. Probably accidental. Probably something dumb. I almost deleted it without listening. Almost. I hit play. At first, just silence. Then the unmistakable ding of a Zoom notification, followed by voices. Tinny, compressed, but clear enough. Valora's voice. "Let's not drag this out." Daxter. "It's settled, right?" A pause. Then Osric, barely audible. "She won't come back, not after she sees it." Valora again. "We've moved on. This is the cleanest way." I didn't realize I was holding my breath until the recording ended. I sat frozen, the phone loose in my hand. They weren't discussing the house. They were discussing me. Not as a daughter or a sister, as a task, a problem, a disposal plan. I played it again, slower this time. I wrote down every word I could catch. Not for proof. For permanence. I needed warmth. Something real. I opened a can of soup I'd tucked under the sink and lit the wax-entwined flame from yesterday. The tiny fire wobbled, almost uncertain, then steadied. As the steam rose from the pot, I felt something shift in me. Not anger, not the kind that explodes, the kind that crystallizes. Moved on? I muttered. From me! I pulled the zip bag I'd labeled the day before. Proof. From my duffel. Inside were the old will, the hospice document, the scratched-out photo, the checklist from Valora. I added the voicemail transcript to the pile. I didn't have a plan yet, but I had intent. The phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered. A man's voice, gravelly but warm. Is this Narina? Yes. My name is Elbridge. I was Eudora's attorney. I handled her original estate file. I just found out the will on record has been replaced. My mouth went dry. Replaced? I didn't approve that revision. I don't think Eudora did either. She had no reason to. There was a rustling sound. Papers, maybe. I'll send you what I have. And then the line went dead. Battery, 0%. I stared at the screen, not surprised, just annoyed at the timing. I had no charger beyond sunlight, and that was fading fast. But I didn't need more words. He had confirmed what I already knew. I'd been written out, deliberately, quietly, illegally, maybe. The house creaked as the wind shifted outside. A tree branch scraped the window. I lit my last candle. The flame danced taller than the others had. I laid out every piece of paper I had, lined them on the floor like sacred text. Not because they made me feel powerful, but because they reminded me I wasn't crazy. They called it a transition. It was a burial. But I had the map. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was sifting through the ashes of what they gave me. I felt like I was holding the kindling of what I was about to build. If they could erase me from the will, maybe I can write myself back in. I walked to the library with the folder pressed against my chest like a shield. The Monroe wind was still sharp, but the thaw had started. Slush pooled at the corners of the sidewalk, and the sun peeked out in fragments through a sky that had stopped punishing. The librarian, a quiet woman named Marla, handed me the key to the community room with a nod. I didn't need to explain why I needed it. Small towns didn't ask questions out loud. Inside, the room smelled like chalk and forgotten bookmarks. I connected the borrowed laptop to the library Wi-Fi and laid the folder beside me on the table. Proof, I'd written on it, though I no longer needed the label. I knew what was inside. I scheduled the Zoom invite. 2. Valora Harding, Daxter Harding, Osric Harding, Rhea Stanton. Subject, clarification. No explanation, no pleasantries. They joined on time. Daxter showed up first, from what looked like his office, shelves arranged just so behind him, like he wanted to be mistaken for someone intellectual. He smiled like nothing was wrong. Narina, he said smoothly, I'm glad you reached out. We were starting to get concerned. Look, there's no need for tension. Let's make this civil. Valora joined next, wearing a scarf that looked like it cost more than the insulation in my entire house. Let's be graceful, dear, she added. There's no need to drag this out in public. You keep the house. We'll help you maintain it. And maybe, down the line, we can revisit ownership if you find it too much to handle. Ownership, like I was babysitting property I didn't deserve. I didn't respond. I clicked share screen. A file labeled proof opened. First came the copy of the older will, clear, notarized, dated. My name in bold under sole heir. Then the hospice record with the faded signature. My name again, listed under primary caregiver. The photo, my 10th birthday, my face scratched out. The checklist. Name removed. Daxter's smile faded. He adjusted his tie. Valora didn't blink, but her mouth tightened, just slightly. Aunt Rhea leaned forward, peering at her screen. She didn't say a word. Then, without pause, I opened the last file. It was a video, Eudora's voice, filmed on her final week. Grainy footage, her face softer than I remembered. Her voice still carried weight. "This house was meant for Narina," she said slowly, "not because she needed it, but because she honored me when no one else did. She didn't visit to be seen. She came because she listened, because she stayed." No one said a word. Rhea turned her camera off. Daxter leaned forward, his hand to his temple. Valora looked right at me, then looked away. I clicked, "Stop share." "I don't want money," I said quietly. "I don't need your help. I want you to leave this alone." "Narina," Daxter tried again, voice strained. "There are ways to resolve this that don't involve—" "If you erase me again," I interrupted, "I'll publish this. Everything." The silence that followed was the cleanest sound I'd ever heard. I clicked "Leave meeting." Back outside, the cold greeted me, but it didn't bite. It felt almost like breath, like the house had exhaled with me. I stood on the library steps, folder back under my arm, and whispered to no one in particular. They heard me this time. I walked home in silence, but every step echoed louder than they ever expected. The house didn't feel warmer when I walked back in. It was still bone cold, but it felt less cruel. Like the air no longer carried their silence, only mine. I closed the door gently, not out of fear of slamming it, but because loud things didn't feel necessary anymore. I kicked off my boots, set the folder on the table, and sat in the same chair I'd used the night I found the will. The same chair where I realized I wasn't crazy. I'd just been quiet too long. The Zoom call from earlier played back in fragments inside my head. Valora's forced smile, Daxter's flinch when Eudora's video began, Aunt Rhea vanishing off screen the moment truth became louder than their history, and Osric, nothing. He said nothing. They didn't call after, no text, no email, no rage, no denial, no guilt. I didn't expect applause, I whispered to the empty room. Just space. I powered on the borrowed laptop again, opened the proof folder. The documents glowed faintly on the screen, like silent witnesses. I opened a new tab, drafted an email, attached every file, and saved it as a draft, just in case. Subject line, truth. Not to send, not yet. I leaned back, no joy, no relief, just readiness. At 9:42 p.m., my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a single message from a number I hadn't saved, but knew by heart. Osric. It didn't have to be this way. I didn't respond. I didn't even let myself feel anything right away. I picked up a pen instead and jotted one line in the margin of an old receipt. No, it didn't. But you let it. That was enough. I slipped on my coat and walked out to the porch. The wind had calmed to something closer to a whisper, brushing past my face like a stray memory. Across the field, one house still had its porch light on. I didn't know the name of the woman who lived there, but Eudora used to wave to her every morning, even in the snow. Even when they forget you, she'd once told me, someone nearby remembers. I watched that warm square of light, not out of longing, but understanding. I wasn't the only person with a version of this story, and maybe I wasn't supposed to be. Back inside, I sat down at the table again and opened a fresh document on the laptop. Title, To Those Who've Been Erased. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a manifesto. It was a beginning. I started with the smell of Eudora's cardigans, lavender and mothballs. The sound of her laugh when she read out loud, that slight rasp that came from too many winters without a scarf. The way she used to tap my wrist lightly whenever she disagreed with me, instead of interrupting. I wrote about how she never asked for grand things, just that people showed up when they said they would, that they remembered her birthday without needing Facebook to remind them. I didn't write about Valora or Daxter, not directly. This wasn't about dragging them through the dirt. It was about digging up the parts of myself they tried to bury alongside her. Each paragraph felt like a slow, steady inhale. Not a reclaiming, but a reintroducing. Of me. To myself. I wasn't writing to hurt them. I was writing to remember myself. The sun had finally returned to Monroe, if only in color. It hung low, glinting off the snowbanks like a distant apology, while the wind carried enough bite to keep every step sharp. I zipped my coat to my chin and walked the 6 blocks to the public records office without looking back. The clerk was the same woman who'd pointed me to the library earlier in the week. She didn't ask questions, just reached under the counter for the request log. "I need all documents related to the Monroe property," I said. "Transfer dates, power of attorney, anything with my grandmother's name on it." She looked me over once, not unkindly, then slid over a manila folder. "You're not the first to ask about this, you know." I didn't ask who else had. I took the folder to a corner table and flipped it open. The paper felt brittle, too thin for what it carried. I read each page slowly, letting the ink settle. Power of attorney revoked, 2 days after Eudora's final hospital admission. Submission date backdated by 5 days. Signature on file didn't match the one I'd seen on birthday cards my entire childhood. My heart didn't pound. It didn't need to. I was beyond panic now. This was arithmetic, a clean equation of betrayal. I returned to the counter. "Can I contest this?" She didn't blink. "You'll need a lawyer, but yes, you have a case." On the way home, I stopped by the bakery. The air inside smelled of cinnamon and sugar, a warm relief after the chill of documented fraud. As I waited for my coffee, a woman behind the counter gave me a once-over, then smiled. "You're Eudora's girl, right?" I blinked. Yes. She used to bring us marmalade jars in spring, said they were from your recipe, said you had the good hands in the family." I nodded, throat tight. "She was proud of you," the woman added, softer now. "Just thought you should know." That night, I boiled water over a small flame and sat down at the kitchen table with the documents. I scanned the power of attorney form, highlighted the submission date, and took a picture. Then I sent it to Daxter. No words, just the photo. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Daxter, you didn't have to go this far. I'm getting heat from all directions." I stared at it, then closed the screen. I didn't owe him a reply. Around 8, I walked down to the community bulletin board near the general store. It was pinned with old flyers, dog walkers, rummage sales, lost cat notices, and something new. A single sheet of white paper, printed in large, bold font. "Truth belongs to those who live it. Eudora's home is not for sale." No name. I hadn't put it there, but someone had. The wind had died down again when I returned to the house. The air was still bitter, but less defiant. I moved slower, with no reason to rush anymore. I locked the front door behind me and turned toward the stairs when I heard it. A soft knock. Not loud. Not urgent. I opened the door to find a woman I didn't recognize. She wore a thick wool scarf and mittens that looked hand-knit. Her cheeks were red from the walk, her breath rising in puffs. "I'm from across the field," she said quickly. "Name's Helen." I nodded. "If you need help keeping the place warm," she said, "we still have wood." Her voice was plain, but it carried weight. It didn't sound like pity. It sounded like a door someone else had opened too. I hadn't asked for kindness, but that's when it started showing up anyway. By the 7th morning, something had shifted. The air still bit at my skin when I stepped out to check the frost line on the back door, but the cold wasn't personal anymore. It was just weather. I cracked the kitchen window open an inch, enough to let out the stale quiet, and put water on to boil with the calmness of someone who'd stopped waiting for the next blow. I pulled on Eudora's old work gloves and headed to the shed behind the house. It leaned slightly to the left and creaked like an old man's knees when I opened the door. Dust danced in the single beam of light breaking through the slats. I started clearing it out, shelf by shelf. Broken trowels, seed packets from years past, an empty birdhouse. In the back corner, behind a stack of rusted tomato cages, I found a wooden box. Labeled in faded pen, Eudora, letters and receipts. Most of it was mundane, grocery lists, clipped coupons, a stack of handwritten recipes on curled index cards. But near the bottom was an envelope, cream-colored and sealed, with one line scrawled across the front. Narina, when you're ready. I didn't open it. Not out of fear, out of respect. She'd written those words for a reason. I tucked it into my coat and returned to the house, sliding it into the top drawer of the desk by the window. It would wait for me, the way she always had. That afternoon, I took a walk through town. The snow had receded just enough to see patches of brown grass and gravel where people had cleared sidewalks. As I passed the general store, a woman came out with a bag of cat food and paused. "You're Eudora's granddaughter, right?" I nodded. She shifted the bag in her arms. "My sister worked hospice, said you were the only one who stayed, even when things got hard." I didn't respond, just nodded again, but the words landed somewhere behind my ribs. That evening, I brewed tea and lit a candle on the kitchen table. The house felt settled. The silence now was one I chose. As I turned toward the hallway, my phone vibrated on the counter. Valora. The text came through like static. "If you ever want to be back in the loop, you know where to find us." There was no sorry, no admission, just a rope dangled with no anchor. I replied, "Thank you for the offer. I'm okay." Then I opened my journal and wrote, "The place they offered me no longer fits the woman I became without them. I didn't need to be in their loop. I had my own circle now, small, flawed, but mine." As night fell, I brought my mug out to the porch. The sky was bruised purple, stars blinking in behind the cloud line. I sat with the sealed envelope in my palm. I smiled at it, like you would an old friend you weren't quite ready to talk to. "When I'm ready," I whispered, and slipped it back into the drawer. Some letters teach you something just by waiting for the right moment to be read. The morning light came through the window, warm enough to skip the coat. I sat at the kitchen table in a sweater, hands wrapped around a mug that didn't steam as desperately as it had days ago. The envelope rested beside me, aged just a little more, as if waiting patiently for my hesitation to settle. I opened it. The paper inside was soft with time. Eudora's handwriting looped and steady, like she never doubted what she needed to say. "My Narina," it began. "I knew they would try to erase you. That's why I hid the truth in layers only you would know how to find. You were always the one who paid attention to the quiet things." I read slowly. Each line felt like a thread, pulling a tight knot loose in my chest. "I didn't leave the house for its value. I left it for its roots. You remember the smells in the pantry, the rhythm of the creaky stairs? That's more than anyone else carried. That's why it belongs to you." Her final lines weren't instructions or warnings. "Don't become bitter. You are meant to restore, not retaliate. This world needs women like you to remember gently, even when the remembering hurts." I set the letter down, and I cried. Not from pain, but because someone saw me without asking me to prove I existed. The house didn't echo anymore. It absorbed sound like it had been waiting for someone to stop yelling and just speak softly. I'd patched the pipes last week with the help of a local plumber who refused to charge me full price. The tiles in the kitchen were clean. I'd cleared the ivy from the side windows so sunlight could find its way back in. Helen, the neighbor who offered firewood, had come by with seedlings, tomatoes, basil, some lavender. "Start them inside," she'd said. "They need a place to take root." A little girl from 3 houses over stopped by the porch with a drawing, crayons and notebook paper. My name scribbled in big purple letters. "Miss Narina's library." I smiled. I didn't correct it. That afternoon, I taped a small sign to the front door. Just a piece of paper with a blue marker line. "Free books, warm tea, open heart." I didn't think much of it. It wasn't a grand statement, just a door left unlocked for once. Later that day, I received an email from Daxter. Short. "It's done. We're out. No more contact from our side. No greeting, no apology." I typed back, "Understood, goodbye." And I meant it. That evening, I walked to the edge of the backyard. Eudora's wind chime was still hanging from the branch of the dying maple. It clinked gently in the soft breeze, making music no one needed to hear loudly to understand. "You left me the house," I whispered, "but you gave me something bigger. A story I get to finish." I walked back inside, pulled open the drawer beside my bed, and placed her letter inside a cedar box I'd lined with my journal pages. I closed the lid gently and turned the small brass key. Then, I slipped it into my coat pocket. Not because I needed to lock it again, but because the keeping felt sacred. I stayed. Not because I had nowhere else to go, but because this time I chose myself first. Sometimes, the loudest victories are the ones no one hears. We don't always need to win in courtrooms or family tables. Sometimes, healing means choosing not to go back to what broke you. I didn't reclaim the house for its walls. I reclaimed it for the truth it held, the voice I almost forgot I had. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if your silence was mistaken for weakness, I hope this story reminds you, your worth is not up for negotiation. You do not need to fight loud to fight well, and you are allowed to walk away from people who only love the version of you that's convenient to them. So I'll ask you, have you ever been erased in a room full of people who should have seen you? What did you do next? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments, or let me know where you're watching from. And if you didn't connect with it, that's okay too. I'd still love to hear what brought you here and what stories do speak to you. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because sometimes the next chapter of your life begins when you finally close the one they tried to write for you.